Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started. My name is Kerry Mullan. I'm Convener of Languages here at RMIT and Deputy Director for the Centre for Global Research. I would like to begin with an acknowledgement of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations as the traditional owners of the land on which the university stands. We respectfully recognise elders past, present and future. This acknowledgement is very appropriate for this afternoon's seminar, given that we'll be talking about language and interculturality, and I think it's important to remember on whose land we're doing that. Actually, it's very early for an aside, but if any of you are interested, there is still time to make a submission to have the 5 new city metro stations named after the 5 Kulin nations of Melbourne. If anyone is interested, you can hop online and find out how to do that. Thank you. That's just slipping my personal agenda in there. So firstly, let me thank everyone for coming today, both our panel of speakers, of course, but also all of you come to listen, staff, students, colleagues. I would also like to thank the Centre for Global Research for their support, and particularly for this event, the organisers for the Centre for Global Research, Beck and Michelle. Secondly, just so that you know, my introduction will go for just under 10 minutes, so please bear with me. It gives me great pleasure to chair this afternoon's Global Friction Seminar. The last one I chaired was in March 2015, a few weeks after the attack on the Charlie Hebdo offices in Paris. And the title of that seminar was Understanding Charlie, the Implications for Language, Culture and Globalisation. I think we ended up with more questions than answers that day, and sadly we've seen several more terrorist attacks and a growing intolerance in our global communities since then. For that reason, it's important to continue to question our roles as tertiary language and culture educators in today's context. The complexities of what we do will hopefully become apparent as we outline some of the things we aim to achieve through language education, both as teachers in the classroom and as language policy makers. Our objective today is to share with you some of the questions that we grapple with at both of these levels in our aim to make the world a better place. I think I speak for many language educators, not exclusively language educators, of course, when I say that we are aiming for nothing less than contributing to world peace in the long run. Speaking of world peace, let me now begin to introduce our panel of speakers, one of whom is involved in an important UNICEF language and peace-building initiative. I'll get to that shortly. I will introduce the whole panel now so that we don't have to interrupt the discussion once we get underway. We will hear first from Professor Fazal Rizvi, Emeritus Professor of Education Policy, Organisation and Leadership at the University of Illinois, and also at the Graduate School of Education at the University of Melbourne. Professor Rizvi has an extensive list of publications, including 7 so far this year alone, on wide-ranging topics such as global studies in education, internationalisation of higher education, cultural globalism and education policy, post-colonial theories of identity, representation and education, global inequalities and educational policy, and international student mobility. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Rizvi back to RMIT, where he was PVC International from 1998 to 2001 before taking up his appointment at the University of Illinois. He was also instrumental in establishing the Globalism Centre here at RMIT many years ago. Things come full circle. Following Fazal, we will hear from Professor Bianco. Not only is Joe difficult to do an introduction for if you don't want to take up the whole seminar, he's also very difficult to keep in the country for more than about 2 weeks at a time, so we're very grateful to have him here today. Joe is Professor of Language and Literacy Education at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education and serves as immediate past president of the Australian Academy of the Humanities. In 2012, he was appointed Research Director of the UNICEF Language and Peacebuilding Initiative in Malaysia, Myanmar and Thailand. Since 2011, he's served as Senior Research Advisor for LUCID, a European Commission project on languages in urban communities, integration and diversity for Europe. Joe also wrote Australia's National Policy on Languages in 1987, the first multilingual national language policy in an English-speaking country. and was Chief Executive of the National Languages and Literacy Institute of Australia until 2002. He has advised on language, culture and literacy education and on the integration of Indigenous and immigrant children into mainstream schools, reconciliation and peace through education around the world. Joe is also on the advisory board of the Centre for Global Research, and he has his own Wikipedia page. Our final presentation will be from Dr. Chantal Crozet, convener of French Studies and Intercultural Communication in Global and Language Studies here at RMIT. Chantal's research interests focus on the links between language, culture, identity and education, and her latest publications include The Intercultural Foreign Language Teacher, Challenges and Choices, On Language and Interculturality, Teaching Languages and Cultures for a Global World, and First, Second, Third Place and Beyond, Reflections on the Philosophy of Self and Identity for Intercultural Language Teaching. She's very well known internationally for her work over the last 20 years in the area of intercultural language teaching here in Australia, with colleagues Anthony Liddicoat and Jola Bianco. So as you can see, we've assembled a distinguished and expert panel for you today. I will shortly be inviting each speaker to give a brief 5 to 10 minute introduction with their position on the topic, after which there will be a general panel discussion and some questions from me as the chair, and we will then open it up to the floor for the last 15-20 minutes or so. Before I hand over to our speakers, I need to ask for your indulgence for just a couple more minutes, as I would like to foreground today's discussion by outlining some context and some of the issues that we grapple with in language education, many of which will be familiar to colleagues in other humanities and social science disciplines, but some of which we think are particular to language education and which our speakers will develop further. Many of you will be aware that multilingualism continues to be undervalued in most Anglo societies due to the prevalence of English as a global language. Despite Joe having written Australia's National Policy on Languages in 1987, you all know where we stand internationally when it comes to learning other languages. Unfortunately, however, trying to articulate the importance of multilingualism and the way our lives can be completely transformed when we speak more than one language is actually quite difficult. Concepts such as developing new levels of understanding the world and becoming true global citizens are actually quite intangible for people until they experience them for themselves. Trying to convince people, sometimes even colleagues, that tertiary language education also involves scholarly and intellectual work and not just skills is our greatest challenge. Tertiary language teaching is always under threat in Australia. The latest threat is that the government intends to stop funding Commonwealth-supported student places in Diploma of Languages programs in universities because they say they do not relate to industry needs and do not articulate into a related bachelor program. The irony of this is that the Diploma of Languages is predominantly a concurrent award taken by students to obtain the equivalent of a major in a language alongside their main undergraduate program to improve their chances of a successful career. Even if we set aside the fact that teaching languages involves intellectual work and concentrate solely on the skills argument, Diploma of Language programs are relevant to any bachelor degree and a wide range of industry needs. If we want to combat such threats to language education, we need to better articulate and continue to question what it is that we do and how that's relevant in today's context. So on that note, I now invite Professor Rizvi to speak to us about the roles and responsibilities, we'll make that plural, of tertiary language and intercultural educators as he sees it.
Thank you very much. That is actually what I was going to speak on until I had a conversation with Joe in the corridor and he asked me to do something completely different. So I do ask for your forgiveness. I want to approach these questions in a slightly indulgent manner by actually saying something about my own language education, both in India and then in Australia, very, very quickly. I hope that the broader issues of what I say would become clear to you. I was brought up in a city called Lucknow in northern India and lived there till I was 15 and a half. when I went to Canberra with my parents who immigrated, and my father worked at the University at ANU. During the post-colonial period in the 1950s and 60s, Hindi, the language, was on the rise. Okay, it was an expression of Indian nationalism and Indian post-colonialism together. I was brought up in a context in which Hindi was the medium of instruction, not English, that came much later, but Hindi was the medium of instruction. At the age of 9, I was told by my parents that I had to learn another language called Urdu, U-R-D-U. Okay, and I was sent off to the classes that was offered as option at my school in Urdu, and I took the classes. There were two things that I became immediately cognizant of. One was just about every person in this optional class was a Muslim. Okay. In other words, religion and language were tied together in the imagination of who does Urdu within a Hindi-speaking terrain. Okay. The second thing that became really quite clear to me is that Urdu was looked upon as somehow an inferior language. At the same time, I learned that in Pakistan, it was completely the other way around, where Hindi, which was also spoken by Hindus who were left behind in Pakistan, spoke Hindi, but were derided, abused, marginalized for speaking Hindi. So in other words, Indian independence and its separation into two countries were largely structured around language, amongst many other things. In other words, language played a great role. I started looking at these issues a little more carefully, and it became clear to me why and how that became the case. To begin with, Hindi was a language that was spoken at that time only about 15% of the country. And Urdu was a language that was spoken only by 10% of Pakistani population. In other words, the two languages, which were really minority languages, had asserted themselves as the hegemonic languages in those two countries, which said something about the regional dominance and class and caste dominance in both of those countries. It is almost as if there was a mirror image. So what was being prized and derided in India was precisely the opposite in Pakistan. And that has remained with me ever since. I think about issues of India, of language and language education generally, through the prism of my own relationship with Hindi and Urdu. Hindi as the national language. Now, it's important to know that Hindi and Urdu were not all that much separable. They were languages that basically had similar vocabulary, similar grammatical structure, similar syntax structure. There were few words here and there different, but the major difference was the script. Hindi was the Devanagari script, and Urdu was the Persianized script. And over script, people fought. Okay? Much of the conflict that existed was over script. The language, when I started learning Urdu, I had to wonder, what is this thing called Urdu? It's exactly the same words, same text, only thing that's different is the different script. So if you actually converted both of those languages into Roman script, there would be no difference, I told him. This is the kind of impression that I was left with. And it became clear where these languages come from. They came from the same region in northern India, in Uttar Pradesh, and they came as an amalgam of a number of different languages. So the language that emerged as Hindi Urdu was basically the same language throughout the 19th century, with a similar kind of vocabulary, except some people did one script and the other people did the other. And I think what that led me to realize is that there was a language that was in the process of being constructed in the same region. So when India became differentiated into two countries, basically the geographical distinctions became aligned to linguistic differences. Urdu became transported from the language, from the place where it was developed to another place where it had no role at all, Pakistan. And vice versa. Hindi was brought from Pakistan into India. And of course, what's happened over the last 200 years is the distinction between Hindi and Urdu has been accentuated. So while the language of ordinary people, if you like, the vernacular Hindi, is roughly shared and is a perfect, good linguistic medium for communication, for intercultural understanding, the language of academic class and of classrooms has become increasingly differentiated. As Hindi words have become increasingly Sanskritized, and Urdu words have become increasingly Persianized. As a result, the communication that was perfectly possible for at least 150 years is becoming increasingly difficult. Okay? In other words, language is being used to create a chasm, a significant chasm. Okay? And that continues to characterize the dispute between India and Pakistan. So, for example, there are people who speak Urdu in official cases. They're told, aren't you ashamed of yourself? That's the language of Pakistan. It is not a language of Pakistan. It's a language of Lucknow, where I was born. Okay, that's where it emerged. Okay, and yet it has been colonized and has become hegemonic in Pakistan. And as a result, everything that is said in Hindi is said in Hindi, not in its own terms, but in terms of how it is to be differentiated from Pakistan. Okay? And of course, when you remember that Pakistan was two countries, Bangladesh and Pakistan, the language of East Pakistan was never Urdu. It was Bengali. And yet, it was assumed to be the language that needed to be spoken in that part, giving rise to a huge amount of resentment and a huge amount of conflict in Bangladesh, which eventually led that part of Pakistan to become independent. So what I'm saying here is it's this story, a story of basically the same language with different script, how it became superseded by formal languages of classrooms, of education, and the educated class, in highly class terms, okay, so that the differentiation has now become so strong that identities of people in Pakistan and India are quite often forged around it. So, for example, what we've seen is a tragic metamorphosis of the vernacular language, Hindi Urdu, what used to be called Hindustani, over the last century and more, from a creative, dynamic, interculturally productive, popular language to, if you like, a dead, Sanskritized, de-Persianized language manufactured in India by self-serving upper class in northern Indian elite, nurturing hegemonic ambitions from a period of, from being a symbolic of collective imagination of people who shared a great deal with each other. It has become a signifier of narrow sectarianism and regional chauvinism. The tract shows, it shows that this transformation of language is tied up with the politics of communalism and of regionalism. In other words, we have produced conditions of conflict in that part of the world. And I think education has played a great role. And in many ways, the kind of demise of Hindi and, if you like, derision of Hindi is linked to a very robust Hindutva and Hindu nationalist agenda, okay, which has its complete mirror image in Pakistan. So the differences that were not all that profound have increasingly politically been manufactured, exaggerated, and have been made to be insurmountable. So I think the point that I really want to make here is we really need to think about how languages come to be, how they become authorized, and indeed how do they become taken up in classrooms, and what role does education play in providing a certain kind of language which is not only a vehicle for bringing people together, but also for dividing people. Thank you.
It's my good fortune to come up immediately after Fazal, because he gives me permission to discard my talk and pick up from one of the points that he made. One of the areas I work in, as Kerry said in her introduction, is Myanmar. Is that too close? That's fine. And as everyone knows who's been watching the media, Myanmar's involved in a relationship, as it were, with Bangladesh, a very sad one today. In the centre of the capital of Bangladesh, in Dhaka, there is probably the only monument in the world to language martyrs. It's called the Shahid Minar, and it commemorates the uprising in 1952 of students who were gunned down by resisting the imposition of Urdu, in fact, to comprise the new nation of Pakistan, combining the Far East and the Far West. And what Fazal described is basically one part of the discipline of language policy and language planning analysis, which is the study of the way in which languages are consolidated and how they then have the consequential effect of consolidating the subjectivity of populations and nationalism. The greatest force for language construction in the world has been nationalism, but it's not the only one. And the first of the 5 main areas of the field of language policy studies, which is, I suppose, what my main discipline is, concerns what basically Fazal was describing so very well. The whole focus of the construction of authorised structures called languages, which are bounded from others, often split off from others to which they were once deeply connected. That doesn't explain all of it, but it explains a large part of it. Now, in language education, there is hardly ever a discussion of where language hits the road, where the rubber hits the road of language studies, and that is language policy and planning. I'm just going to mention the other areas of this so that you can see that there's a complete set, but the most problematical one is the one that Fazal was talking about, that is the attribution of status to some languages, the denial of status to others, the development of the corpus of language, which is the third of the 6 main areas of language planning. I'll talk about them in a moment. The development of corpus of languages to make them diverge to reflect different nationalisms or to make them converge. You can see this happening right now in Spain, actually, and there'll be a very problematic referendum on the 1st of October for Catalonian independence, which is based on very much around language reasoning, the oppression of Catalan under the Franco dictatorship and the rebellion that it has given life to since the democratization of the country. So language planning is a really important area in which language becomes a social vehicle. I think it's the most under-researched and misunderstood area of conflict in conflict studies. In fact, very few people actually do research on this. In Sri Lanka, where I lived and worked in the 1990s, there were 2 sociologists, very distinguished American sociologists, who studied exactly the same phenomenon of the civil war in Sri Lanka that had started in 1956, and one of them said that language had nothing to do with this conflict, and the other one said that language had everything to do with this conflict. And that's because people really don't name the same thing when they name language. One of them imagined one thing to be language, and the other one imagined another thing to be language. And that's because language has this particular property that no other human construct has, that it is both the vehicle for our expression of other meanings, and it is a meaning in its own right. Now, no other human attribute has that. Maybe, possibly, 1 or 2 have parts of this. So language is really massively underrepresented. If the theme of this is global friction, you're going to have to tell me when to stop because I'm not timing myself. If the theme of this is global frictions, I think we should actually focus on the ways in which language is a mediator of friction. But language is always, because of its essential quality in dialogue, the resolution of frictions too. So we massively misunderstand. Part of the work I've been doing for the UN is to actually look at and critique the instruments that they use in dialogue studies, and they are the most unreflective instruments imaginable, that people who go involved without any intercultural preparation with materials for dialogue in conflict zones in Sudan and Burundi, which is about to become a very similar mirror image, Rwanda, Burundi, to what Fazal was talking about between Pakistan and India, the same proportions of the two main groups but in opposite ratios, with designs of mediation that are based on Western psychology and even marriage guidance counselling and conflict reduction in settings like that. Nothing informed through this really long history of research in the social language sciences, sociology of language, sociolinguistics, psycholinguistics, which has reflected on conflict and language for 35 years in a very systematic way. There's practically no use of this enormous knowledge base in conflict reduction practices that the UN engages in. It's quite extraordinary. When you look at it, you can see, not that I've ever been involved in marriage guidance counselling, but you can see that I ask colleagues of mine who do that kind of stuff, and they say, yes, that's exactly what we do when partners are fighting, de-escalation methods, ways, and there's a little bit of a focus on language, but there's very, very, very little, and none of it is informed by the discipline that we're working in. So I'm going to return to my points now by saying that we really have to appreciate much more systematically at this time of transculturalism that language is a vehicle for enmity creation. In the south of Thailand, another place where I've been working, we've tracked violence and conflict and connected them to speech and discourse and to education. And we've distinguished between two effects that language has on violence and conflict. A fast-acting effect, which is where we can actually track an upsurge of killing, violence and school bombing, which occurs very often. More than 8,000 people have been killed since 2004, including 200 teachers, and speeches that are made in the national capital, Bangkok, which local people regard as demeaning to them, excluding of them from the idea of citizenship or of belonging to the nation. There's a direct correlation between what they interpret as hate speech and violence. So this is a fast-acting effect. This is one way in which we can track language, the use of language, because this is part of language. Speech-making is language, after all, and violence. And then the other effect is the slow-acting one of unequal education, poor education, refusal to include minority languages in schooling, teaching children inappropriately in languages they don't know, especially Indigenous and minority children, and the effect that this has on dropout rates from schooling, or rather push-out rates, how Indigenous kids are pushed out of schooling, how they underperform in schooling, how they don't gain literacy, how they become unemployed, they leave school early, and they become available for radical messages from extremists and then become involved in that, or in criminality or other kinds of things. This is a slow-acting effect of bad language policies, and then we have the fast-acting effect. So the 6 dimensions of language policy and planning and how they connect to global frictions are the status and position of languages in society, especially in massively multilingual societies like the ones in Southeast Asia that are attempting to construct nation states but built on European models of one nation, one language, one official language representing everyone. That's basically the story that Fazal was telling us. Grossly inappropriate to massively multilingual settings. So status planning is the first of these. The second one is corpus planning, and that is how we change and develop languages internally over time so they can take on expanded functions. And Catalonia is a wonderful example of this. After many years of oppression, the Catalan language has been restricted just to the kitchen sink and to the home and to speaking to parents and elderly relatives, and through corpus planning it's expanded, so now they can educate at university level and do nuclear science and physics at any level of high-level intellectual work in the language by expanding its vocabulary, its ability to speak to and be involved in different disciplines. The third area is language education planning. This interests us most, and this is an area where it's very clear that centralised education systems simply cannot cope with multilingual populations. Just consider that Papua New Guinea has 860 languages. In 1991, they started to decentralise away from Port Moresby and allow local villages to employ local teachers, and within 2 years they were able to teach in 110 languages. That's not possible to do if you want to centralise everything in the national capital and organise it through 1 or 2 officials who are going to do this. If you give away some of the authority, you decentralise, it's possible to do it in hundreds of languages. There would be no reason why it couldn't be done in thousands of languages. You just have to be able to let go and relinquish some of the power that comes from centralising. And now, through English pressure, in fact, Papua New Guinea is re-centralising its education system, and it will produce the same result, large-scale failure, because children will not understand what teachers are saying. The fourth area is prestige planning. I'm not going to say anything about that, but that's how oppressed languages manage to gain prestige, usually through literature or through rebellion, political rebellion. I can tell you some really interesting stories about African-American English. And if you think about hip-hop and all the ways in which African-American forms of expression have become popularized and become you just need to remember that for generations of teachers in the United States were trained to say that this way of speaking is gutter talk, it's rubbish talk, it's non-intellectual, you can't have double negatives in English, all of these kinds of things. And now it is actually through a kind of transgressive kind of language planning come up and become very popular in the world, and is actually subverting the prejudice that has come from on high. And the last two, and I won't be able to say anything about them, but I think you'll appreciate how important they really are. The last two are domains, domain planning, in which domains do we allow languages to be spoken, and the very last one is discourse planning, the way in which the ideas of people are influenced by language. And the most gross way in which this happens, of course, is through brainwashing. But all forms of change in language to allow new meanings to come in is discourse planning. And this is a very under-researched area. And one of the most important areas that this focuses on is citizenship and belonging, generating new language that allows minority groups to participate. My last comment is to say that in some societies, and Myanmar is the one that I'm going to think about in saying this, but I won't give you a lot of examples, the way you talk about who is allowed to belong, who is allowed to call themselves a citizen, and that word is not actually present in the discourse anyway, is a result of discourse planning, so that ethnicity, language and togetherness in the society are generated through debate about citizenship in relatively open societies over a long period of time. In societies that are coming out of 50 years of dictatorship, that process hasn't happened. So the debate about who belongs, and when people are actually thinking about who is the other, the enemy that they can push out of their society, there is always a language story, unfortunately, behind it. Thank you.
So my contribution will be from the perspective of the language and culture educator and researcher that I am. After the Charlie Hebdo killings in France in January 2015, the first area targeted for change by the then Holland's government, apart from national security, was education for a better vivre ensemble, literally meaning living together, and referring to harmonious living across different cultural groups on a national territory. It is usually opposed to communautarism, defined as the withdrawal of a cultural group into their own community. In today's global world, this vivre ensemble within and between nation-states involves knowing how to create intercultural spaces which cut across linguistic and cultural divides. Though the onus is on education at large to prepare the next generations to navigate across these divides for the sake of world peace, teaching languages and cultures from an intercultural perspective, which I will refer to as intercultural language teaching thereafter, has a particular contribution to make towards this goal. In a nutshell, the intercultural bit refers to the integration of a dimension of reciprocity, the interbit, and of social historical understanding, culture, in approaching the teaching of language and culture. The notion that an intercultural dimension ought to be part of the development of communicative competence in a foreign language is not new. It emerged in Europe in the early 90s and was prompted by the increased effect of globalization in areas such as world finance, trade, economics, law, new technology, and education, which had created the need for more foreign language speakers capable of acting as cross-cultural mediators within and beyond national boundaries. For scholars such as Bahram, the intercultural dimension in foreign language education has always included teachers' educational and political engagement. In other words, it has always required teaching languages beyond purely instrumental and practical ends, giving centrality to culture and context as the drivers of meaning-making. Prior to the emergence of intercultural language teaching theory, culture tended to be thought of as being separate from language and largely as national, homogeneous, and static. By contrast, intercultural language teaching views the culture or cultures associated with a particular language as complex webs of variability within and beyond national boundaries. The standard language and mainstream culture of a given target country may still be taught in the language classroom, but only as starting points, without the pretense that all native or non-native speakers of that standard language speak and act culturally in the same way under all circumstances. In other words, intercultural language teaching involves the teaching of critical skills to see and analyze conformity as well as resistance to national culture and national language use. It includes teaching and getting learners to engage with different registers and genres in all skills, speaking, listening, reading, and writing. The native speaker is no longer posited as the norm to emulate. It is replaced by the multilingual and intercultural speaker, and it gives hybrid identity legitimacy as an increasing workable reality for many. Aside from the unsettled issue regarding which culture ought to be taught in a language classroom, the noble or the vulgar, as a way to put it, or both as interrelated and in support of each other, some gross anomalies remain, in my view, regarding the choice of cultural content in support of a stronger political engagement in the field. For instance, religion and patriarchy as ideological systems which underpin any culture on the planet are seldom perceived nor consciously taught as part of culture, yet both are at the forefront of current societal big issues on a global scale. Another issue is the critical teaching of history embedded in culture teaching, or what Friedman coins memory study. How are language teachers to approach it and implement it? In French studies, for instance, to integrate a critical dimension in the teaching of French history implies, in the first place, teaching from a francophone rather than a francocentrist perspective. In other words, it implies bringing a global perspective on French national history. This is a common issue across languages which are associated with old imperialist powers, such as English and Spanish, for instance. So after global English, Englishes, and global Spanish and Spanishes, are we to rethink the learning of French and French studies, for instance, in terms of global French and Frenchies? What does this mean in terms of selection of new linguistic and cultural content? The judicious choice of linguistic and cultural content in itself amounts to political engagement and goes hand in hand with choosing to teach interpretive analytical skill, something I don't have time to expand on now, unfortunately. Both are also linked to another big issue, that of bringing or not bringing controversy and real communication in the classroom. Case studies on language teachers' take on the intercultural perspective and political engagement have shown teachers' reluctance to disturb the calm and a threatening atmosphere in their classrooms with controversial topics. The tension teachers see between controversy and sensitivity is most interesting and may become clearer through the following hypothetical example in the form of a question. Is a teacher in a French program in Australia who engages students in a discussion on black slavery when some of her students in the classroom are from a black African background a controversial or an insensitive intercultural teacher. This is largely a matter of how the topic is introduced and dialogue facilitated between students and between teacher and students. Real communication on this topic would require knowing how to engage with students on painful past history, unveiling one's personal opinions in an equally positive dialogue with students, the kind of Socratic dialoguing scholars like Adriana Diaz have referred to in her work. As in real life, real dialoguing in the classroom requires sensitivity and has to do with a teacher's disposition rather than knowledge per se, something Claire Cranch alluded to more than a decade ago, when she asked whether language and culture educators were ready to examine their own cultural premises, reveal their opinions and their own interpretation of text, and engage in double-voice discourse with their students. Up until recently, the key to the good teaching of cultural content was perceived to include impartiality and impersonality, especially when it involved potential controversy. In short, it was to be personally and politically neutral, unengaged. Teaching was not meant to involve the teacher, paradoxically. It is therefore not surprising that many teachers are reporting staying away from real communication on controversial topics with their students. This explains in part why the traditional information transfer pedagogy still tends to dominate in many language and culture classrooms. Real communication in the classroom, to me, also implies inviting political incorrectness in it. On that note, and as an example, RMIT recently announced publicly that it supported marriage equality, as if it were a political party. I actually felt quite offended that RMIT was telling me what to think as an individual. I would have preferred to have heard that RMIT supported strong democratic debate on marriage equality. I would think that tertiary education, in particular, is not about telling students what to think, but to invite them to examine their own minds and hearts, to hear what others have to say, and then make up their own mind. My nearly 30-year experience in tertiary education, 30 or 20 years, have shown me that the number one challenge in my language culture classes and in my intercultural communication course is to get students to think critically. That is, to think for themselves from an informed basis. In our current frightening post-truth era, bringing real dialoguing in support of critical thinking and informed positioning constitutes the basis of what political and ethical engagements means to me in the context of my teaching and research on language, culture, and intercultural communication. That's it. Thank you.
As two of our speakers threw away their notes, I may have to throw away all my questions that were pre-prepared. Can I firstly ask if any of you would like to respond to anything the others brought up? This is what it's like in the classroom when you ask a question. If not, I can ask the first question. No, is there nothing that you would like to respond to?
Well, just one thing that to me it's very important to work on the connection between big pictures, such as we've heard from Fazal and Joe, and the smaller pictures in classes or in any work in the field. Yes. So that political engagement requires those two dimensions interacting all the time.
I think at the same time it needs to be noted that the two things are inextricably connected. That we mustn't reify the big picture and reify the little picture, because the little picture is quite often an example of something that is much larger in relational terms. And in contrast, there is no big picture without lots of little pictures. So I mean, I'm sure you agree with that, but I think it probably needs to be said that we mustn't draw the contrast too harshly and too definitively, but focus rather on the relationship and how the little picture is actually does consist of some fairly major historical and social and global forces, as well as the local specificities.
Maybe Chantal, if I can ask you about the politically engaged teacher who might make those connections between the big and the little pictures. What about language teachers who do not want to be politically engaged? Do they exist? What do we do about them? Do we have a general philosophy on language teaching?
Well, this language policy, I don't know if there's philosophy as such, but it's certainly something that, in my view, we could do with a little bit more of. But to answer your question, sure. I mean, political engagement is not something that we tends to be included in language teacher training or in any other form of learning we do prior to practicing. So, and political engagement is it's not. Yeah. Oh, right. Yeah. It's a choice ultimately. I don't know if I'm answering the question.
Yeah. But I mean, not all teachers are comfortable with being politically engaged. I suppose the other thing then I would like maybe all of you to comment on is how do we choose then what we take into the classroom? How do you choose those topics? If you want to be politically engaged, how might you choose that? Because there's so much to choose from. How do you limit that and get some of these ideas across in the classroom?
Yeah. Well, I think there's one part of it that's just unavoidable. I'll give you the example of a teacher from Sydney who was an English teacher, and she, at a certain point in her career, goes to Timor-Leste, and she's done a whole lot of programming at the university about critical literacy and critical language teaching, and she's focused on the idea that language education has to engage with problems in the real world. And after teaching like this for a couple of weeks to quite radical people in Timor, one of them takes her aside and says, look, we fought in the jungles for a really long time. We don't need, actually, our English teacher to teach us how to be radical. And I think that's a really interesting problem, because I think what I'm trying to say there is that what we radicalise in curriculum has to be about what language predisposes us to silence. In other words, we have to expose what's normalised in language, which is bad in some kinds of ways, the ways people are excluded, the way power operates, and whereas I think what counts as critical literacy and critical education often is something that we do in our lives as citizens rather than in our classrooms. So I just want to make that point, because I think we can't ask teachers to do in their classrooms things that are extraneous to teaching. It has to be something, and language always deals with points of culture that students are going to find problematical in some way. If you study some languages, you're going to have to learn to normalise ways of referring to other people which don't happen in English, which imagines itself to be much more free and direct and democratic. So those things emerge normally in the learning of another language, and I don't think that, and what language education does is it makes you accept those differences and operationalise them, whereas if you're going to criticise them, you're then put in a position of critiquing an entire culture. It's it's full of dilemmas for language teachers. But what right do they have, really, I mean this provocatively, what right do they have to position themselves as critics of something else? They have to be, in the way Chantal very correctly said, they have to be able to really raise these things as points of discussion and debate, because students inevitably encounter those things when they're studying another language.
I think I wanted to say something. I mean, I have come across lots of teachers who just run away from anything that has any kind of indication of politics. You know, they think they're there to teach language, and that's all that they are. You know, so there's huge reluctance and lack of preparedness and lack of commitment and timidness too. You know, all those sort of things. But I think there is a paradox that lies at the heart of their refusal to be engaged, because not to be engaged and not to actually make clear as to where the language has come from and the role that it plays in various power relations in various ways is itself a political position. You know what I mean? So that you cannot actually avoid that. To actually sort of say, no, I don't want to have anything to do with it, is implicitly to actually accept the status quo as it then exists, you know. And I think that's what the paradox is, you know, because I can see the risks and dangers in doing it, you know, bringing into the classroom civic activism, okay? But at the same time, not bringing it is itself a form of activism, you know. So I think that's where the position of a teacher becomes even more difficult, because they are at the heart of this complex paradox, and they somehow or other have to actually do something to reveal to the students where the language has come from and what kind of role it plays to, you know, what does it do in relation to social, cultural, political, and economic relations, because it does all those sort of things. And to actually sort of say, no, I want to shut that out or bracket it out, is perhaps even a more radical position than to actually make it explicit.
You can define this as the ideological dimension of the language, where it comes from and the role the language plays in society.
Yes.
Beyond our understanding of politics about languages, the ideological dimension.
But I don't know, here at RMIT, in the review of the French studies program that we've worked on the last few years, our take in bringing more of an intercultural and political dimension in the program was to deliberately choose to deconstruct the French call it the roman national, the national novel of the myth of French history. So very early slowly but surely from our second year, we start reflecting on the construction of Republican identity. And then we move on to what we call the other France. And that leads us to then looking at the Francophone world. And then the construction of the national novel starts. And what do we do? That's big. You say, but you're not a historian. How do you do that? And so we have to find, that's why it's very difficult and challenging. I mean, I'll keep working on that for the rest of my career, I think. But for example, in the advanced French course at the moment, looking at Francophonie, we start, before we look at some literary works from Francophone writers, I try to give students some idea of French colonial history. But again, how do I do that? I've got 3 hours. And one way that seems to work is to talk about the colonial exhibition in Paris in 1930. And so we look at concrete examples. I show documentaries on a group of Kanaks, for example, who were brought into Paris and required to act as savages to justify colonization. Here they're savages and we're going to civilize them and so on. And I did this on purpose because I thought that we could then link this to Australian Aboriginal history. And it works quite well. You know, when I come to ask, well, can you make any links with what's happened here in Australia? And surely it happens. I found though that one big issue is that students, well, you can expect that they wouldn't have too much knowledge of French history, let alone of French colonial history, but they also don't have much knowledge of their own history, and in particular of Aboriginal Australian history. So they've actually asked me, with my French background, can you tell us about it? So they know some little bits. But this is all part of, it's not trying to be the historian that I'm not, or the sociologist that I'm not, but it's all about consciously bringing that critical and political dimension in our teaching, and that's part of interculturality. It's work in progress. I would say that it's the beginning of that kind of work after the big theoretical framework, or work that has been done more in terms of the teaching of cultural codes in language, bringing cross-cultural pragmatics of conversation analysis, things that we try to do in our level. But in terms of the cultural content, more linked to history and society, there's still a lot of work to be done on this, how we approach it, what we choose, and so on. Yeah.
Because language teachers are generalists rather than specialists, it comes down to then what you choose to take into the classroom. I wonder if you could all comment on perhaps the parallels between that and the debates at the moment around academic freedom and what we should and shouldn't be commenting on as academics, because it almost trips over into that arena when we try and overstep perhaps what we've been trained to do.
Well, I think that if you look at the recent moves for citizenship, the citizenship law in Australia, the design of what the Minister was trying to do was so absurd in academic terms and what we understand to be academic terms. And so let's ask ourselves, as citizens and what it's academically appropriate to comment on, why in a whole debate about that is there no voice, no systematic presence of the voice of language educators, in that particular case, people testing language, specific centres of excellence in the testing of language in 3 Australian universities, a lot of people who research questions of proficiency and learning and age and all of these things that are relevant to citizenship and the age that people come in. Absolutely none of this is present. So I think, yes, there is a question of academic freedom and staying within the fields that you have expertise in. And then there's the related question of in fields in which people do have expertise, there's absolutely almost no voice of not the knowledge brokers in our community. And I think that's really, really sad. And I can think of many other areas outside of language education where that's true, but just to stay within our field, there are quite a few areas of public policy development at the moment like that, and the absolute storehouse of knowledge on all of these fields is completely absent from the drafting of legislation and the administration of measures.
Yeah. I mean, the challenge for us also language educators is that everything we do it in the foreign language, so it's always double-edged. It's teaching about French colonial history, about we do francophone literature in the language, so it's always a double challenge. And compared to teaching intercultural communication, which is more directly reflecting on language and culture. So from that other perspective. Yes, it's
Joe, is it not possible to say that language is beside the point in the citizenship test? That citizenship test is designed to not test language, but test something completely different as to who should be allowed in and who should not be allowed in. And language just happens to be one of the criteria. So, you could argue that the policymakers that are developing these citizenships are not really interested in language. They just want to use language as a bulwark, so to speak. I'm asking you this somewhat provocative
You're
question.
being agent provocateur, as you often are. But how would you critique that anyway? You would critique it from a language basis, because what it had within it was a design for admission to citizenship that most international students would struggle to achieve. So, and the general public had no access to the really easy way in which academics would be able to dismantle these arguments. They had no way. It was never included in anything. We needed actually to suggest to policymakers a new way of doing public policy that allows expertise in a more systematic way. I can think of ways to do that. It would move us towards a more deliberative, voice-based democracy than what we've got now. And surely the more technical society gets, the more that has to happen. And we should do it from our point of view. It involves English, obviously, but it involves other languages as well. There is another one right now that I gave the example of Myanmar. Because of the transcultural reality that we live in that characterises the world, issues that are prominent somewhere in the world have very big domestic consequences. There are diasporas of every international community present in our society. I'm involved with some other people in Australian domestic questions related to this, deeply linked to language and participation and all of that. This is the multilingual reality, and not just the language education reality, the multilingual and language planning reality that we have to accept, which actually drives a lot of people crazy because they don't want this to be the case. They want minorities to have no opinions about their home countries once they migrate. But that's never been the case, and it never will be the case. But we can present, I think, more sophisticated arguments about multilingualism, multiculturalism, and these things. We need to generate a new language for this, I think, because the old language is a little bit tired now. But we need to do this, and we need to label these connections much better. If you think about the last major report that Australian government produced on Asia was the Julia Gillard's the Henry Report 2012, and you look at the depiction of Australia and Asia in that, it's like, a 19th century image of the nation state, this bounded space with people are barely in contact with each other. There's all these people who speak other languages and they're all over there, and we are all this kind of person we have to learn. This is still very prevalent in government, and we obviously haven't had an impact on changing their view of the country they even live in themselves.
Just to add to your point, I agree with you. I did ask you a provocative question. But one of the things that citizenship tests generally are supposed to be picking up on is one relating to social order, social cohesion, and securitization of various kinds. You assume that those are the purpose. Let's accept, for the purpose of argument, that those are in fact three major concerns for having these kind of barriers towards citizenship, who is in and who is out. Now, it could be argued that language test of any kind is neither necessary nor sufficient for making judgments on those criterion like social order and social cohesion. It is possible to have language and still be troublemaker, and still be insecure, and still be, So in other words, the relationship is much more complicated one than the language test will ever reveal. So as a result, the argument that you can make about using these austere tests is, what are you trying to do? It will not deliver on the ends that you have in mind, except in the symbolic way, as to sort of let people know that unless you are one of us, then you are not one of us. Basically, that's what it amounts to. So in other words, the purpose is not social order, but social differentiation. Differentiation is the more important driver of these tests rather than social cohesion.
This might be a good time to throw questions over to the floor. I will hand this mic to Beck, who's going to walk around. How did I know?
All right, jumping out of my seat here, because I obviously agree with a lot of what you say. So I'm Georgina Hayden, director of the Centre and also a linguist. So I'm going to resist the temptation to give the talk that I'm giving next month. But
which I will plug it.
I was thinking about the role of, it seems to be a heavy burden for language teachers to be responsible for delivering all of our education about how language works. And, wouldn't it be better if our politicians were informed, perhaps in their primary school education or their secondary school education, or even if they'd missed out on that at their tertiary level, about how language works, no matter what their area of expertise. You know, isn't it something we need to be embedding in education? Because at the moment, we're not, and that's why you can have politicians making ridiculous policies like a language test for citizenship, because they're ignoring or they're ignorant of basic facts about language and linguistics, and so is the population. So nobody questions it, because nobody really understands. They don't know what they don't know.
But how would it be possible for public education about language to happen if it weren't led by language experts? And I think, so there's a catch-22. But I agree with your basic point, absolutely, that I think language awareness, which is a different thing from language proficiency, really should be pervasive in the curriculum. And in fact, what tends to happen in the worst of situations, and it's not always like this, is that most secondary school teachers don't even imagine themselves to be involved anymore with anything called literacy or even language education. And every single subject in the curriculum involves its disciplinary literacies, its disciplinary discourse at university level. So what people want to do is to contain language just down to the lowest levels, and certainly literacy, down to the lowest levels, and say it's a complete closed job, and then once that's achieved we can go on and deal with content. But content and language can never be separated like that, and there's a fundamental misapprehension about that that's really very problematical. So these debates, when they ever get into the media, are always very simplistic because the level of knowledge is very slight. So I agree with the basic point very much.
I'm not suggesting that it should be done by people who are not experts in language or linguistics. I think more jobs for linguists.
Can I actually say something? I think an awareness of the ways in which language get formed, historically, sociologically, etc., is a good thing. You know, who does it, of course, is another question. But you know, and I think I agree with the earlier conversation that it's not possible to know which history and which sociology is relevant to an understanding of a language or whatever. You know, but I think a curiosity about the historical and sociological is something that can be taken in dispositional terms. In other words, get people to actually not simply look at language as something naturalized and self-evident, but something that emerges out of certain social and historical and political and economic conditions, you know, and as a result have a general curiosity about trying to find out so that they can perhaps make an attempt to ask the question, how did Hindi got to be Hindi in the way that it is? Most people in India don't understand that, and as a result they don't understand the animosity that is now emerging towards Urdu, for example. You know, so I think those are the kind of questions that appear to be, but they don't require deep historical knowledge, but they require at least historical sensitivity towards the questions.
Thank you. My name is Danny. I was provoked by Joe when he talked about the Papua New Guinea who has hundreds of languages. It's a reflect to my own country. I came from Indonesia. We also have hundreds of languages. It's totally different language. This is the problem that both of you with Professor Rafael said about the idea of modern state, nation state with one language. This is what happened in Indonesia. Hundreds of these languages, some already vanished, gone. Some are dying because the new generation are migrate from their habitats, the habitat from the traditional community into new nation, what's called Indonesia. So they left the language. Now, I think how multiculturalism could be conserved, because things that I want to add is the economic dimension of it. Indonesia is not a rich country. To decentralize their education into hundreds of languages I can imagine how much money needed to decentralize into this ethnical traditional languages. Hundreds we have it. Another thing is another layer. The source of knowledge mostly in Indonesia came from foreign, Western, translated, adopted, absorbed, sent students study abroad like in Australia and bring back. Just can't make it. If it's any insight to think about it, you know, or maybe books, paper that I could read, because for me it's just lost on my mind. It's too big, because I can imagine with all some main problem in our country, economic, and suddenly think that I know the importance of this multiculturalism, multi-languages, but that's the consequence of it, money, budget, just don't have idea about it. If any study about it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Actually, Indonesia is a major focus of a big study that was done by a group of people in Bangkok called the Mother Tongue-Based Multilingual Education Network, which is a UNESCO network, and in many parts of Indonesia there is really extensive multilingual education that is very similar to what was done in Papua New Guinea and is just as successful as it is everywhere it's tried, and that is initial education in children's language, a transition to Bahasa Indonesia, and then the introduction later of English. In fact, English in Indonesia has now been pushed back up into secondary school in some places and upper primary school. It used to start much earlier. I strongly agree with the idea of delaying it, because I think for especially children who don't speak Indonesian at home and for smaller communities, it's actually better than for them to be grounded in their first language and Indonesian first. So it's actually not particularly, it seems to be much more expensive when we think about it in the abstract, but it's actually not, from 3 points of view. Firstly, the dropout rates from schooling when you do multilingual sequencing, like I was describing, are much, much lower. So many children continue in school and succeed in schooling who would otherwise drop out if they have the first, and this is particularly true of girls, but it's also true of boys in the upper primary school level. Secondly, the groups that tend to fail most are marginalised poor communities and indigenous populations in that thing. And this is bad for social cohesion, because often they develop a resentment for being excluded from the benefits of schooling and learning the main language. And the third thing is, actually, when you decentralise like that, you're not decentralising everything, you're just decentralising initial education. And it actually, the models for doing this are really quite well worked out. The country in the world that's doing the most on this today is Philippines, and the same results that was originally found in Papua New Guinea are being found there, and that is that many more children stay at school longer, they like school better, their parents understand what's happening in school more, they can help the children with their early work, they otherwise can't do it if the teaching is just in English or Filipino. So there are many reasons why it is better education in general, better for children's literacy, and then better learning of the national language and then an international language. So I think Indonesia is a participant in this program in quite a big way, and the success of it is just as true in Indonesia as anywhere else. But I accept what you're saying, it's a very complex problem in your country more than in most.
I just want to follow up the point that many of you made about the diversity of languages within a national language, I think. And as a lifelong learner of very bad Greek and Italian, I'm very familiar with this and being told by teachers that this form of Italian is the purest form, and that's why we teach that, which bollocks, clearly. But you know, national languages are, like history, are written by the winners, clearly. And so the power is in the powerful groups decide which language becomes the official one. And as a learner of a foreign language, if you're interested in the culture and history, you sooner or later come to realise that. But it doesn't, as a learner though, you have an interest in learning the dominant form, right? That empowers you, that gives you the status in that society. And I've been in Greece with my relatives and seen the young people mock the Greek that their parents and grandparents speak, because it's an older, archaic, devalued regional form of Greek, not standard Greek. And so as a learner of Greek, why would you want to learn a version of Greek which is going to be mocked? Right? But I'm interested in this, interested in how you teach then students to understand the power of the form of the language they're learning. But also in teaching English, because the predominant language that we teach in Australian institutions is English to tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of young people. But it seems to me there we're teaching a standard form of English without really reflecting on other forms of English and the power that standard form has. And I was really struck a few years ago when I came across a high school textbook on Aboriginal English, which startled me that there was such a thing as Aboriginal English, and then reading through it, realised that actually that form of English was very similar to the rural working class English that my relatives spoke where I was born in Mildura, and that's taught in high schools was fascinating to me, because in universities we don't really, even in social sciences, we don't really often address the class dynamics of the language that we teach. When we teach students how to communicate, we're not really reflective about the class dimensions of the type of English that we're teaching. And that troubles me, but at the same time I wonder if it's worthwhile for students to know that anyway. You know, for the students to be empowered, it's in their interest to learn the dominant form of the language, and while we might be sad about that, that's what students, in the best interest of students. So I'm wondering, as educators, how do you grapple with that?
Well, in intercultural communication here at RMIT, we do teach about, class, gender, and different registers. And students respond very well, because it's allowing them to reflect on themselves, to recognize themselves. We teach them about power. And definitely our take is that education in a language, being educated in any language, is to be able to navigate all the different levels. So you can have power, you can own power in the standard form of language, and you can mock in the appropriate register, and you can joke in the appropriate register. I'm always fascinated to see how good politicians, good politicians in terms of those who can relate to the crowd, they're very good at moving from, higher forms of language to lower forms of register. So that's definitely our take. And that's a form of political engagement. I taught at the ANU in French Studies for many years, and that's a struggle, and that was part of my political engagement with my own colleagues, where I introduced deliberately the teaching of different registers in French language, and not just for the sake of it, but in terms of power and education in that broader sense. And many of my colleagues thought that it was outrageous, that we should be teaching Parisian written French, I remember that colleague, and not all that stuff that Chantal was teaching. And the focus was that that's all they could remember, that I was teaching colloquial French. I was teaching colloquial French and formal French, and the difference between the two, and the power that you can have in both. So that's my answer. It's definitely that perspective. And it's there in the intercultural communication course.
I relate to what you're saying, absolutely, Chris, because I've experienced that myself. But I've delved into it in relation to Hindi and what's happening in the part of India that I come from. And there is a distinction drawn in that part of India between vernacular, organic Hindi is Hindi of ordinary people, and what's called Shubh Hindi, which is the Hindi of that which has been determined by, masters of Hindi, basically, and then there is another distinction drawn between, so there's a distinction between organic Hindi and inorganic Hindi, basically. Okay, and then there is another distinction between Dehati Hindi, you would know that, and metropolitan Hindi. And I remember talking to a language teacher of Hindi who said, saying, the purpose of my teaching is that I take granted that Dehati and organic Hindi, and is to bring them to understand the metropolitan and Shubh Hindi, that is, the authorized Hindi. In other words, same Hindi, but Hindi that is educational Hindi, as opposed to organic, everyday Hindi. It's a very, very sad story, actually, in many ways, because it creates a whole range of distinction, and it privileges the metropolitan against the Dehati, the villagers, in a way that is really obnoxious, and you wonder, actually, and yet, if you like, the conditions of life as such, economic life in particular, is most of the jobs require you to have metropolitan Hindi, so you're caught in a kind of a contradiction, as to whether you pursue the kind of journey that he's recommending, pedagogic journey, from Dehati to metropolitan, or you basically sort of say, no, Dehati is as valuable, as interesting, and as rich, and indeed it is, and as creative, as Hindi that is inorganic, which is formulaic, which is not really spoken by anybody until it has been prescribed in some official register. So I think those are the kind of really very interesting questions that your discussion kind of raises for me.
Yeah, I agree. It's a very good question and a very interesting point. And I have, like everybody who has a migrant background, my own experience of exactly the same things. And one of the things that happens for migrant children who learn the standard form of the language at home is that when they go to the home country, they end up sounding like their great-grandparents. And this is a very odd thing to do when you're talking to young people. But I think that language is about identity as well as communication. So there will always be variation inherent in language. And if we can't teach all forms of language, and we can't practically, we should at least include, when we make our choices about the norms that we teach, positive attitudes to different norms and awareness of them, and people can understand much more than they necessarily produce. I think teachers can make a distinction between what it is they're actually expecting a student will use themselves and know, and what attitudes they have to variations on that, and even just the knowledge that there is that variation. And this goes back to Georgina's point about low levels of awareness. People are surprised that language varies, but it does. It varies all the time. People imagine the dialects will all go out of existence. They don't go out of existence. They come back in, they become popular, they become forms of resistance to new arrivals. Northern Italian dialects revived when southern Italian workers go and work on the factories there as a point of differentiation, saying, you really don't belong here. We don't identify with you. Do we really belong in the same country as you? So language always carries this meta valuing of and structuring of identities and group relationships. It's always going to be there, and it's very important that within the choices that we make in education, but also in policy, that there is focus on attitudes, ideologies and variation, as well as what we actually explicitly impart to teach to students.
Can I just add to that as well? President Trump is a great example of a politician who isn't able to move across all those levels. I saw a great clip yesterday on the news with someone...
His English is neither organic.
Exactly. A great clip about how he is stuck in a sort of teenage, very informal way of speaking, and that he's he tweets like that and he always speaks like that. He's actually not able to move up to the register of something you might expect from the President of the United States.
Maybe he should be kept out of the country.
I think so. We've got 5 minutes left. I'm just going to take another 2 very brief questions if we can.
Please.
Please? Okay. That's okay.
Thank you very much for an interesting presentation. My question is actually for Joe. I'm obviously a member of the Australian Myanmar Institute and I have an interest in Myanmar, but I would like to relate back to something that's been under discussion here, where you have an individual level of expertise, you have an academic level of expertise as a body within a university, and we have a government advisory capacity. So when you say, for example, that the government legislation that's being created isn't being informed by academic advice, and then we as a government, as an academic institution, or as an individual like you, are going to a country, for example, like Myanmar, where they're very, very resistant to taking advice at a policy level, and we're not actually instituting best practice here in Australia, how can we present best practice models to places where it might be even more difficult for people to actually try to implement those best practice ideas?
Well, that's a great question that's troubled me a lot, and I've published something last year about the ethical dilemmas of advising in language policy situations of conflict. And of course, when you come in as an advisor, especially if you're not representing your government, which I never have represented my government, I'm working for UN agencies, and you're there presumably because you have some level of technical ability to contribute. And I always negotiate that in the dialogues that I do with people about what different people's roles are, what they expect of me, what I can do, what I can't do. And actually being an outsider often is a big advantage, because outsiders, in some respects, not in all respects, outsiders have the disadvantage of not having enough local knowledge, and you can never have enough local knowledge compared to insiders, but they have the advantage of not having interests and a history in conflicted situations that is often present among people. So it's a question of negotiating these things, of declaring interests, of talking about them. And I think it's very interesting when you look at the ethics clearances that universities require, how inappropriate and inadequate they are to cover situations when you're abroad, when you're actually asked to give answers to questions which there's no way you could know without a lot of research, and you have to think on your feet. This happens all the time. That's why those assignments are so exhausting. And so you're positioned outside of your normal context. That gives you a certain amount of, if you do have something to offer, it's around technical ability or procedures for resolving problems that people who have had conflict among themselves are not always able to do. But when we look at the instruments that the UN system and other agencies have available to them, I find that, as I was saying before, they are hopelessly misinformed about what we know from dialogue studies. There's 45 years of studies of dialogue in intercultural situations, and the UN system, which is the biggest body on earth that deals with intercultural relationships, barely draws on this material at all. And that's because it's informed by very hard power ideas of how to solve conflict. And I think that this is an enormous future for language studies, contributing knowledge, contributing methods, contributing forms of dialogue, and understanding deep language functions. So, I think it's a wonderful question. There's a lot of complexity in it, but I think that actually we're a long way from really understanding all the dimensions of it even now.
Just if we as a government are not, we're putting restrictions on citizenship applications that are language-based, and we're then in an advisory position to a government, for example, like the Burmese, who are very resistant to those kinds of ideas. How do we have the moral authority to be able to give those people advice?
But that precise issue has arisen in relation to citizenship, and what we have done in several sessions is we table the legislation in Australia, and we discussed that as transcultural citizens together, just debating the deficiencies of what my country does and what we could learn from the deficiencies of what my country does to local things. It wasn't a question of representing anything. No one was representing anything. We were exploring together possibilities, and of course, we know the situation around citizenship in Myanmar, and it is deeply connected to language questions, but not proficiency. It's about identity in relation to language. So I think it's a question of being clear and open and honest about things, but people are not representing authorities and certainly not governments.
I believe there was another question that I have kept missing for the last few minutes, so if you'd like to answer yours, we will make this the last one.
I'm thinking to how to integrate culture when I teach English for my students, where my context is Islamic University, and actually I also speak, my mother tongue is Javanese language, my national language is Indonesia, and I also learn Arabic because of religious values, and now I want to be English teacher in the future. And also I'm thinking, because language and culture is the thing that is integrated, because culture is about share meaning, while meaning is produced from language, and how to teach English language with integrated with culture, especially where this language is come from foreigner. English is from Western language, for example, Australia, American, British, but our context is really unique and complex. Also multicultural students. Yeah, so I would like to ask your suggestion. Based on your experience.
I don't think there's one answer. You have to start somewhere. That's the issue for language teaching. You actually need some content, and you can only go global, to a point. So if I can just take an example, in French studies, we make choices. So, for example, as I was saying before, in advanced courses, we choose to look at Francophone literature. But it doesn't mean that we're not going to refer to French national culture in that way. So you can't teach everything at once. You have to choose to. In your case, will you look at British culture or American culture or Australian culture? You need a starting point, and then build from that. See what is more suited to your context. There's no real answer to this one. It's something we're still grappling with. How do you bring a global perspective when you have to teach a particular content? That's all I can say. I don't have more of an answer on that one. What seems to be important to me is to choose cultural content that's going to that students can relate to. So rather than perhaps looking at which culture from which English-speaking country, look at themes, like, for example, identity or patriarchy or religion, and see what you could use from different bodies of literature from different English-speaking countries. That's another way to come into it. I've actually seen a book was just sent to me that was just trying to do that. Start with topics rather than start with a particular culture. So that's still a big question, that one. How do we bring a global perspective on teaching culture in a particular context? That's a big one.
I think if there were an easy answer to that, we wouldn't have needed today's seminar. We'll give the last word to Joe.
No, I'd just like to say, that I think it's possible to distinguish between levels of culture within language, which are absolutely necessary to teach because students will have trouble communicating if they don't understand those. And this will be about choices that English makes about how to refer to people, that it's easy to call anybody you and to introduce yourself as I. And that this is really essential to know that, but it actually can be taken for granted very quickly and taught very quickly. And then there's high-level forms of culture in the way Chantal was talking about now, the way in which English has stood for and represented particular cultural traditions. And then there is something like this, which is English as a lingua franca, that is when English actually is used transactionally between people who are non-native speakers of English. The vast majority of people who talk English in the world today are not British, and they're not American, and they're not Australian, and they're not talking to people who are British, American or Australian. They are Indian people who might be talking to Bulgarians. So English, and many languages, but English particularly, has this function today. And in a new big kind of literature, that's culture that's negotiated in communication. And the topics people can be talking about can be anything. It can be Islamic religion, it can be economic development, it can be travel and tourism. So what people bring to those conversations culturally as assumptions are ones from their own traditions. So language is incredibly multiple in its cultural, in how culture is related to it.
Thank you. Hopefully we've conveyed some of the complexities around language and what we do. Now I understand why we're always so tired. We're trying to do all of these things together. Before I plug the next seminar, would you please join me in thanking the panel of speakers today? And for those of you who are interested in the topic of language, the next Global Friction Seminar will be on the 26th of October. It will be given by Dr. Georgina Hayden, who is Director for the Centre for Global Research, and it will be entitled Ignorance is Not Bliss: How Widespread Misconceptions About Language Cause Systemic Failures in the Justice System, which I cannot think of a more perfect follow-up from today's seminar. But thank you everyone again for your contributions, and we'll see you on the 26th of October, hopefully.